Father, you have established your throne in the heavens, and your kingdom extends over all. Tonight, we lift our voices with your angels and your saints to bless your holy name. We thank you for the gift of music that lifts our hearts and our minds to ponder your eternal glory. Look with favor upon our RCIA candidates and sponsors as they journey toward a more intimate relationship with you. We make this prayer through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you. I've heard many people over the years comment on how powerful music can be as a way to pray, something to strengthen people. And then, as always, with our goal for our prayer, not only to kind of set the tone for our gatherings here in the evening, but also to help you learn various ways of prayer, to discover the best way for you to make that connection with God. And probably the best ways to pray for us are not going to be a single way, but a variety of ways, different ways of coming into contact with God, ways that tap into all the different parts of what it means to be a human being in the first place. So thank you for sharing that, a different approach. Before I get into the topic for tonight of our commandments, Patty asked me to speak a little bit about the names of saints. Because one of the traditions in the Catholic Church is when someone is confirmed, they have the opportunity to choose the name of a saint as a particular patron for them. A saint that can be a part of your identity, a saint that can be held up in a particular way as a patron saint for you. So I want to describe that a little bit so that you can have some time between now and Easter to really think about what saint you would want to use. And in the sacrament of confirmation, we will actually use the name of that saint to confirm you, to really establish that identity. So when our 14-year-olds are being prepared for confirmation, that's a big part of what they have to do. They have to learn about a saint, write a story about a saint, choose a saint that has a particular importance in their life. So that would become then your patron saint, a name that you can use. You can question Catholics and ask them if they know who their confirmation saints are. So I want to bring that up. There's not a particular rhyme or reason to it. To how you choose your saint. It's a matter of spending a little bit of time just kind of searching. Most people, if they don't already kind of have a clear sense of who the saint is, they start just doing searches in saints' books or online to find different possibilities of saints. And part of the value of it is the time that you spend learning about the different saints. So you might start with a saint that is a patron saint of a particular thing that you're involved with. It makes it easy in the days of Google to just search patron saint of whatever and see what you come up with. Saints that are related to places maybe where your family has some heritage, or different ways of just coming across those saints that you might be interested in. So please take some time to go over that, to look at some saints, and then Patty's going to want a list of those names, because we will print them on the name tags that we use when the Easter Vigil does come. My confirmation saint was Andrew, and a large part of that was that I was confirmed by Bishop Andrew MacDonald, who had a great affinity for his own name. He would always recommend, anytime he was asked to do a baptism, that they include Andrew in the name somewhere. So not only was he the bishop when I was confirmed, but through other family friends, we had become friends with Bishop MacDonald. And so he was very much a role model as a priest for me, in addition to being the bishop that confirmed me, and then eventually the bishop that would ordain me a priest. So it was his personal example that drew me to Saint Andrew as a patron. Okay, the topic for this evening, the commandments. So last time we talked about the sacrament of confession. We talked about preparing for confession by doing an examination of conscience. And there, I mentioned last time, there are various approaches to an examination of conscience. If you look online, you can find reflections from kind of different starting points. But the most common, of course, is going to be the Ten Commandments, holding up for us this list that is meant to be the guide for our behavior. So we want to talk tonight then at greater length about these 10 commandments, to go through them. The goal for this evening is not going to be so much to kind of take each one and work through all of the layers of what it includes, but rather to spend a big chunk of our time in understanding what the commandments are in general. And then with time that we have, we'll go through as many of the commandments with a greater depth as we're able to. The first thing that I want to point out is that you will find that in the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, even though we have the same commandments, we number them differently. So you'll find if you look at people making a reference to the sixth commandment or the eighth commandment, they won't always be exactly the same one. Or if you see somebody that has bought some kind of frame, 10 Commandments or whatever, it'll be different depending on where you get it. So the 10 Commandments are the same overall, but what the Catholic Church does is combine some commandments that are separated at the beginning for Protestants, and then separate some commandments at the end that are combined with it for Protestants. Okay, so it's the same content, just different numbering, because in the Bible, it's not just kind of laid out exactly. There's a couple of different versions of the Ten Commandments. So how they get enumerated varies somewhat. So I just want to point that out before I forget about it, but they are the same commandments in their content. So if we go to the first slide there, this is where we want to start with. Okay, what are the commandments really? And in the minds of many people, the commandments are very much tied to Charlton Heston in the famous movie, The 10 Commandments, as he received from on high those stones engraved with the 10 Commandments. So this is kind of the image that we have, not only of Charlton Heston as Moses, but then I think the particular image of him as holding them and pointing. What we tend to think of is this is our list of thou shalt nots. So people think about the commandments in terms of this. Here's the stuff that you can't do if you're going to be a Christian. And this particular image kind of reinforces that image because he's clearly not playing around with what it is that we are supposed to do. So I want to bring this up because it's important that when we think about our growth in faith, that we pay attention to certain obstacles to our growth. And one of the obstacles to growth that can be in us are biases that we don't even realize that we have. So we are trying to grow in an understanding of faith, and we're trying to grow in a practice of faith in a day and age that doesn't have much appreciation for either. In a day and an age where we are immersed in our culture and society in ways that did not exist in generations before. It is a fairly recent reality that we are affected by global realities, that we are affected by the fact that we have a 24-hour news cycle, that we check our phones constantly, and what everybody thinks everywhere all the time soaks into our lives. And even if there is a part of us that is conscious of how we try to look at the world differently, we cannot be immersed that fully in the world around us and think that it has no effect at all. So it's important in our growth in faith that we are aware of how the world around us sees things so that we can better make an assessment of how much of that shapes how I see things and how much of that should shape how I see things. So these perceptions of the commandments are very important for us to be aware of, because the commandments are a great deal more than this. And it's very important that we recognize that there is that tendency to think about the commandments in terms of the list of stuff you can't do. Because even people who decide that they are going to embrace faith and practice a Christian life, when this mentality seeps into us, it can cause us to have some sense that we're missing out in some way, that we are accepting restrictions on our life that can make it harder for us to think we're enjoying what this world can offer. So it can cause some tension in us, especially when we are challenged to take a step in faith, when we are challenged to make changes to our behavior. The voice can be a little stronger that says, you don't want to really make this sacrifice. And so this idea that the commandments are primarily about thou shalt not is something that we need to understand, be aware of, so that we can understand differently. So if we go to the next slide, we can start to consider a different way of thinking about the commandments. Now, I'm going to read for you some of the Scripture's treatment of how the Ten Commandments are given. Because the first thing that I want to emphasize is that the commandments are not just a list of behaviors. They're not just said, if you're going to follow me, you can't do these things. But the commandments are rather an enormous part of how God reveals Himself. Remember something that I have tried to emphasize time and time again, that the real heart of faith is communion. The desire of God is a shared life. He gives us life itself in creation so that we can be a part of Him. And then we are called to live in such a way that we stay within this perfect life of God. But because of sin, the understanding of this life with God gets distorted. We have Adam and Eve in that time in the garden before sin where they live in that perfect communion. They understand themselves, they understand each other, they understand creation in terms of this perfect unity. Sin disrupts that unity, and it blinds human beings to the truth about many things, including the very ability to look at God. The communion of Adam and Eve was so perfect they could look at God, whereas after sin, they didn't have a concept of how to look at God. It wasn't even thought possible to look at God. So it was always this awe-inspiring and terrifying reality. And yet God is little by little leading us to a closer unity again. A unity that will have its primary moment be the life and death and resurrection of Jesus, moving us toward the return to that perfect paradise in heaven. So the commandments are first of all understood as God revealing Himself, God making known to us. So what I want to share with you is not just the passage that lists the Ten Commandments, but I want to read to you how God prepared the people to receive them. Because the commandments are a gift from God. A gift from God to help us to live our lives well. So we need to think about them. So we have this quote from the Catechism, the 10 words, okay, a term that you'll see in theological writing in the Catechism, for example, is the word decalogue. Deca means 10, so it's the list of the 10 laws. So you'll see them referred to that way. So the 10 words point out the conditions of life freed from slavery to sin. The Decalogue is a path of life. So we need to think about this. This is God's gift to us. God says, you are suffering because you are separated from me. You are suffering because you are blind to the reality of who you are and who you are with me. The commandments were given when the people had literally been set free from slavery, and now they were wandering in the desert, lost, alone, afraid, uncertain, trying to trust in God, but without understanding what that means. So the commandments were meant as a gift, God giving a gift to draw them into this communion more completely. So I want to read a little bit of what is given to us. This is from the book of Exodus, chapter 19. So I'm not going to read the whole thing. I want to set it up and then read a portion of this passage. So the people had arrived at the mountain of Sinai, and God had made it known that He would reveal Himself there. But because God was revealing Himself, the people, they had to prepare themselves for this. Coming into contact with God is not something that should be done casually, something that they should do without a second thought, but rather it was meant to be a recognition of the fact that the God who demonstrated such power in freeing them from slavery was now going to show Himself, was now going to draw them in to a deeper understanding of what life with Him means, of what faith means. So God gives instructions and has chosen Moses to be the one to ascend the mountain, the one to speak with God and then carry the message back to the people. So God said that He would come to this mountain. He says, "I am coming to you in a dense cloud." So try to picture this scene. They had seen the power of God, parting the Red Sea, saving them from their pursuers. They saw the power of God. There was the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire that was guiding them. And now they're so said, God is going to appear on this mountain and it's going to be covered in this dense cloud. They are to prepare themselves with certain rituals, cleansing, purifying, making sacrifices, opening the door to be able to receive what God is going to give to them. He told them that they needed to prepare for 3 days for this encounter with God. So now I want to pick up reading from this setup. On the morning of the 3rd day, there were peals of thunder and lightning, and a heavy cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. But Moses led the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stationed themselves at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was all wrapped in smoke, for the Lord came down upon it in fire. The smoke rose from it as though from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The trumpet blast grew louder and louder while Moses was speaking, and God was answering with thunder. When the Lord came down to the top of Mount Sinai, He summoned Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up to Him. Then the Lord told Moses, "Go down and warn the people not to break through toward the Lord in order to see Him. Otherwise, many of them will be struck down. The priests, too, who approach the Lord must sanctify themselves, else He will vent His anger upon them." Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot go up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us to set limits around the mountain to make it sacred." The Lord repeated, "Go down now, then come up again along with Aaron. But the priests and the people must not break through to come up to the Lord, else He will vent His anger upon them." So Moses went down to the people and told them this. And then what follows is God delivered these commandments. And it goes through the list. "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that place of slavery." He identifies Himself, the God who set you free from slavery, the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The reason I read all of this, which can be strange to our ears, to talk about the wrath of God, for example, it can seem to only reinforce the Ten Commandments as the list of you better not or else. But that's to only look at it from our kind of modern perspective. A modern perspective that too often belittles what it means to come into contact with God. We are talking about the God who created the universe. And in earlier classes, we have talked about the fact that this God would eventually come to us in the form of a baby. That God would condescend to share our life, to become one of us. Eventually, to even go further and give us Himself as food. But we should never lose sight of the fact that what we're dealing with is the Creator of everything. And the reason that that's important is that our fundamental disposition, the way we stand before God, is to realize that God is God and I am not. And if God is really God, then I depend on Him entirely. That God knows things that I cannot even begin to comprehend. That if I am going to make sense of my life, if I'm going to make sense of the world in which I live, I have to recognize that only God can offer that understanding. So, if I'm going to receive something that challenges me, like the Ten Commandments, the only way I'm going to rise to that challenge is if I believe that the giver of this challenge is worth my attention, is the God of power that can bring life. If I don't understand that this is what it's all about, drawing me into the life of this God, well, then it's easy to think about the commandments as just a list of rules. A list of rules that we should follow most of the time. A list of rules that opens the door for a part of us that says, okay, I'll follow them, but I wish I didn't have to. That says, wouldn't it be more fun if I could do what I wanted? A voice that can challenge us and say, you're missing out on what other people are doing. The only way to get past those challenges that are part of being human is to recognize the point of the commandments is bringing us into contact with this God. This God who knows us because He created us, who gives us this book of the law not to restrict us, but to open the possibility of truly being human, of recognizing that as human beings separated from God, we are in danger. There is much that threatens us. But our God is powerful enough to protect us. Our God loves us enough to guide us. So we have to realize, as the starting point for the commandments, that it brings us into contact with this God. The second quote from the Catechism there at the bottom, the gift of the commandments is the gift of God Himself. God is revealing to us who He is. It's part of drawing us into communion with God. The source of everything that is good, that's God. These list of commandments, these are the things that will take you away from God. These are the things that if you choose them, you are rejecting God. Because God is all perfect in every way, that we cannot be part of God and choose imperfection. So to choose sin is to choose not God. That was not understood. And even now we can grasp it at some level, and yet we are still drawn to not God. And we have to work against that voice that tells us not God is better. So we have to keep in mind that the goal that we are pursuing is not be good boys and girls. The goal is God. The goal is that security that comes with living within the divine perfection. It's what we're made for. So to reject God and choose sin is ultimately to reject myself, to reject who I really am. God revealing Himself, God giving us the gift of Himself and His holy will is so that we can understand who we are and can choose to live who we are made to be. So in making His will known, God reveals Himself to His people. So think about God's will. We exist because of God's will. If God did not desire that you exist, you wouldn't exist. So for God to reveal His will is to give us insight into who we are. And the commandments are meant to be that security, that protection. So again, the first quote, the commandments point out the conditions of a life freed from sin. Now stop and think about it in terms of the list of the thou shalt nots. We have the part of us that says, well, I don't want to be limited. I wish I could do these things. But if we really stop and think about it, would you consider yourself better off if you were able to lie and cheat and steal as much as you want? Would that make your life better? Probably we all have the experience of the times that we choose to lie and cheat and steal, and then we see the consequences of it. We're not better off. Everything gets harder and more complicated. So to think about the Ten Commandments as the will of God, the conditions of a life freed from slavery, is God saying, you know, I created you. I know how you work. I know that you're not better off with these things. So I will give you these commandments as parameters for your security, as a safety net for you, to help you understand who you really are. I want to make clear to you exactly the kind of things that will harm you. Think about it in a simple kind of medical reality. There are certain things that most people can have that some of us can't. Things that are not harmful in general. But I have a particular allergic reaction to them. The chemistry of my body doesn't process them the right way. So this thing that can be not only harmless to somebody else, but maybe even beneficial to them, could cause me real damage. And if I don't have that knowledge, then I can do ordinary things without being aware of it and hurt myself. But if that doctor can give insight into who I am, then avoiding certain things that others might have allows me to thrive. A better way of thinking about what the commandments are. God's saying these are the things that will cause you harm. And if you are aware of them, you can thrive. The commandments in that light can be seen as a great deal more than just a list of thou shalt not. We'll go to the next slide. The quote from the catechism that we have there is a quote from St. Irenaeus. St. Irenaeus, one of the great teachers of the early church. I found this beautiful picture with another quote from him that's not related to this catechism quote, but is such a good quote, I wanted to share it anyway. The business of the Christian is nothing else but to be ever preparing for death. Now imagine that quote, just hearing those words. You want to be a good Christian, prepare for death. Sounds kind of morbid, right? People might hear those words and think, well, why would I want to live like that? But attach those words to that picture. That's a picture of death. Those words with that picture look a little different. We're made for that. We're made to ascend that ladder where Jesus can welcome us with open arms. The Jesus who wants to welcome us is doing everything possible so that in the journey, during this passage in this world, we are living with God. So everything about the Christian life is about preparing for death, preparing for that moment of being received with God. In that light, it's not morbid at all. It is our great aspiration. Now, the quote from St. Irenaeus in the Catechism's treatment about the commandments. The Lord prescribed love towards God and taught justice towards neighbor. Okay, Jesus reaffirms this, right? The two great commandments, love God, love your neighbor. St. Irenaeus points out why this is, so that man would be neither unjust nor unworthy of God. Because of sin, we have a tendency toward injustice. We have a tendency to choose the things that demean and weaken us. So the commandments are given so that we can be just, so that we can be worthy. Thus, through the Decalogue, again, 10 Commandments, God prepared man to become his friend and to live in harmony with his neighbor. Friend of God, friend of neighbor. The words of the Decalogue remain likewise for us Christians. The 10 Commandments were not dismissed when Jesus comes along. In fact, far from being abolished, they have received amplification and development from the fact of coming, in the fact of the coming of the Lord in the flesh. Jesus points this out himself. He says, I have come to fulfill the law, not to abandon the law. Now, his conflict with the Pharisees very often was all the ways they had added laws. So when Jesus says the law, he doesn't mean the specific things that he ends up arguing about with in the Gospels, but he means this, the fulfillment of who we are. The readings at Mass we've had the last couple of days from the book of Hebrews have highlighted the change that comes because of Jesus. That the law that was given on the tablets of stone so that they could be known and followed, with Jesus they become written in our hearts. Jesus makes it so that we can live these commandments not as an external list of rules to follow, but something written within us. This idea of writing it unto our hearts connects the idea of the commandments with the life of the church. Remember, in our treatment of sacraments, we talked about the fact that God intervenes in our life and changes us. God makes us his own through the sacraments. So because of the power of God coming into our lives, the very will of God is written on our hearts from within. And the will of God is revealed in part in these commandments, so that we can live the life of love of God and love of neighbor. Now, before we move into the specific commandments, there's one more idea on the next slide. Freedom. Freedom is one of those concepts where we have to be very careful how much the world around us influences our understanding. The surface level notion of freedom is I can do what I want. Freedom means no restrictions. I am free when I do what I want to do. That is the clear and repeated message of the world in which we live. And living in the United States, we have this value of freedom that is championed as part of our national identity. Freedom is accepted as a value that we should pursue. Freedom is a value that we should pursue, but not in the way that it is defined by the culture around us. Because part of the nature of the devil that is tempting us to follow not God is to twist something that is true and turn it into something that is distorted. So freedom is essential to being human. But the notion of freedom should be understood because it is easily twisted. And as soon as we have the idea that freedom means I can do what I want, it already has been twisted. Free will means that God gives us the choice to follow Him or not. We are created with free will. We must choose to receive what God is giving. The commandments are meant so that we can understand what God is giving. But that does not mean, then, that I am free whenever I do whatever I want. So it's a concept that I've wrestled with over the years, trying to understand better. And what is written at the bottom there is the definition that makes the most sense to me. That freedom means that there is nothing preventing me from being who I was made to be. When I am free, there are no obstacles. There's nothing in the way. I have to choose that. Now think about the idea of freedom being I can do whatever I want. The reality is I have free will, but as soon as I choose something that is harmful to me, as soon as I exercise my free will for sin, what is happening, in fact, is I am surrendering my freedom. Every time I choose the bad, I give up my freedom. So it takes an act of the free will so that I'm saying I'm no longer free. Because soon as I choose something harmful to me, I am bound by that. I am enslaved to that. The truth of God, the truth of the commandments is to point out to us that these things that appear so attractive, in fact, are chains. I already mentioned that we know we're not better off when we lie and cheat and steal. We have the capacity to lie and cheat and steal, and as soon as we do, everything gets worse, not better. So the exercise of the free will for sin does not make me free. It surrenders my freedom. It gives up what it means to be free. The only way to be free is so that nothing is preventing me, that the path to union with God is unhindered. So the exercise of my free will needs to be so that I am breaking down with God's grace every obstacle to living as I am made to be. Jesus holds up the value of freedom, but He says the truth will set you free. And then when a Pilate asks Him, what is truth? We have the voice of Jesus that says, I am the way and the truth and the life. So He points at Himself. But we must choose that path. So we remain free as long as we cooperate with God, who clears away the obstacles to being sons and daughters. And when I turn away from that path and I exercise my free will for sin, I am now enslaved to that sin. I no longer am free. So this is our struggle. And part of our struggle is not only that we recognize what is harmful to us that we should avoid, but also that we recognize the voice of a culture that tempts us to distort freedom. So the commandments then, in that light, can also be seen as a gift, as the way for us to live the path of freedom. At various times in our classes, I have talked about looking at the relationship with God in terms of the relationship of parents and a child. The rules that you give to your child are so that they can thrive, so that they avoid the things that will make them less than they are, that will restrict them in some way. And so God gives us the commandments as well. So with those notions about how this brings us into a relationship with God, a better understanding of what freedom means, before we get into some specific commandments, I want to highlight for you that you should look at the catechism when it comes to the commandments. I have never seen anything anywhere that gives a better treatment of the commandments than the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Very thorough treatment of these commandments. So I would recommend that you take some time reading through the sections on the commandments. It can be a very thorough way to prepare for confession, because it'll certainly highlight everything that would be related to these commandments. But what I find really powerful about the Catechism's treatment is that it does not only give a list of here's the stuff that you can do that breaks this commandment. It does give that. But it also highlights the point of the commandment. In the Catechism's treatment of the commandments, it highlights what we aspire to because of that commandment. So it's really beautiful to read each one of them in light of how the Catechism points us to thriving when we follow the commandments. So the last slide that I have points this out a little bit. So the first column is the list of the 10 commandments. The second column are quotes that I pulled out of those sections of the Catechism. So just a quick kind of glance at the way that the Catechism holds up for us the thriving that we aspire to in following the commandments. So the first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you shall not have strange gods before me. This is the living out of faith, hope, and love. To have God as God means that those virtues that God infuses in us can be lived. When we fail in this commandment, we struggle in faith, hope, and love. Now, I also want to point out something that is a very common approach to the 10 Commandments, especially as people consider it for confession. It's not uncommon for me to hear somebody say they haven't been to confession in a long time. And when you ask a little bit about why not, then they'll say almost literally, and I have heard this many times literally, I haven't killed anybody. So in the minds of many people, the 10 Commandments are, did I kill anybody or not? It's only one of the commandments. But it's also true that it's pretty rare for people to confess the first commandment. Because we tend to think, kind of like, I haven't killed anybody, we tend to take what's the surface level worst part of that commandment and say, I haven't done that. It gets harder when we get to don't lie, for example. We're not as good as avoiding that one, maybe. So this commandment, I have no strange gods before me. So we picture bowing down before a golden calf, worshiping some false god, and then we say, I'm good on that one, I haven't done that. But think about all the other strange gods in our lives. Think about what occupies our time and attention. Think about how we spend our resources. There are all kinds of things in our lives that we give the center place in our lives instead of God. The kind of thing that I put in the middle of my life and say, my happiness and everything else revolves around that. If we're honest, we have lots of strange gods. And we replace those strange gods frequently with the next thing that has captivated our attention. The commandment is given to us so that we can aspire to be the kind of person who lives in faith, hope, and love. When those virtues are being lived in me, I cannot be separated from God. I cannot live separated from God if I have faith. If my hope is real in that God is the only one that can provide what I desire, I can't have hope and really be separated from God. And love then, love is the embodiment of that relationship with God in a combination of how I feel and what I do. The second commandment, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So people ask, well, what exactly are the words that I shouldn't be saying? What's included in that list? Primarily, it's taking the name of the Lord in vain. But what the Catechism teaches us, what we aspire to, the gift of a name belongs to the order of trust and intimacy. A name. Think about somebody that you love in a trusting and intimate way. When their name comes into your mind, when it crosses your lips, what goes with it? An understanding that that represents a person that I care about. And because I know and trust and intimately love this person, that name can't even cross my mind without associating it with this person that I love. It will change the way I speak it. It will change what's behind it, even when I see it written somewhere. A name is a way to capture a certain understanding of a relationship. So for God to hold up His name is a way to challenge us to recognize the kind of trust and intimacy that we are made for. Am I careless when it comes to the name of God? The third commandment, remember to keep holy the Sabbath, the Lord's Day. One of the commandments that's not written in the thou shalt not terminology, so it's a little easier to see. But what the Catechism holds up as our aspiration, a quote from Scripture. This is the day which the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Keep holy the Lord's day, a day the Lord has made for our rest. A day that God said should be different than every other day. In the minds of many people, commandment number 3 means, did I get to Mass today? The commandment is not, go to Mass on Sundays. That is a command of the church, but that's not one of the 10 commandments. The commandment is, keep holy the Lord's Day. It doesn't say keep holy 1 hour of the Lord's Day. It challenges us to aspire. Now remember again, what do we aspire to? We aspire to freedom. We aspire to understanding who we are made to be in our relationship with God. And God understands us so well that He knows we need a break. He knows you won't survive if you don't rest. He knows that the demands of your life take you away from all kinds of things that are of greater value to you, like family. And He says, here's a day to come back to who you are. Don't lose sight of who you are. And as soon as we abandon the Lord's Day, we lose sight of who we are. How many of you spend your entire Sunday doing other things and feel free? Of course not. Because the point of the commandments is for us to be free. The fourth commandment, honor your father and your mother. Again, one of the two, thou shalt not, that avoids the thou shalt not language. Clearly, we are aspiring to that relationship. But the Catechism points out the family is a privileged community. It goes on to describe that it's a privileged community because God is a community. God exists as Father, Son, and Spirit. The family reflects the reality of God. First of all, in the marriage that we've talked about. And then as that marriage bears fruit in the growth of love that is children and a family. So we are made for that kind of community because it reflects who we are made to be with God. The fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. The aspiration is that human life is sacred. How we treat human life reflects our freedom. It comes down to the command to love. This is repeated time and time again throughout the Scriptures, not only in the Ten Commandments. To love requires that I understand the life of this person is sacred. And so we aspire to looking at each other as sacred, of seeing in you God's own child. My life is better. I am more free when I see you in terms of who God made you to be. So I am given the commandment to hold your life sacred. Not only to protect you from the harm I could do, but I am called to hold you as sacred for my sake. If I see you as anything less than sacred, I am less because of it. The sixth commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Chastity. The church uses the term chastity to refer to sexual appropriateness. To be chaste is the call to each one of us. It means that sexuality is a gift from God that reflects something of the creative power of God, that reflects something of the unity that we are made for. But chastity is lived according to a state in life. So chastity means when I have committed my whole self to another person in marriage, that the sexual relationship with that person is appropriate because it reflects the truth and beauty of who God has made us to be. So the Catechism challenges us to this integrity. The chaste person maintains the integrity of the powers of both life and love. Thou shalt not steal. I find it very interesting that if you're looking for what the church teaches about social justice, what the church teaches about caring for the poor, you will find it in the treatment about the seventh commandment. When it says, thou shalt not steal, we aspire to the command of justice and charity when it comes to earthly things. The basic idea is that whatever we have in terms of earthly wealth is a gift from God and is not meant to be hoarded and used selfishly, but is meant to be a cooperation with God for the service of others. And when I do that, I am free. The eighth commandment. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Entails honesty and discretion. When we think about it that way, it highlights for us what it means to be free. When I am honest, part of discretion means that I am practicing the fifth commandment. If I understand that you are sacred, then my discretion about you is part of how I protect that reality from the dangers of the world around me. The ninth commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Okay, in the Protestant numbering of these, they combine the ninth and 10th into you shall not covet. The Catholic Church separates them, and the Catechism holds up this beatitude: blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And then the 10th commandment about not covering your neighbor's goods. Where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. So the Catechism holds up for us this aspiration that reflects our freedom, that tells us, consider your treasure. And if you're not sure about what treasure you hold dear, think about stuff. Because it's very easy for that stuff to occupy a place in your heart that reveals God is not really your treasure. Okay, so we'll end there. Again, I recommend that you take time with the Catechism. Read through those sections on the commandments. They are powerful, and they can be a very thorough way to examine the life that you aspire to. And then in closing, I want to point out that this should be connected to confession. When we talked about confession, for as scary as that might be, the point is so that you can leave confession free, that you can be who God made you to be.